Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a concept that completely redefines what it actually means to be a true expert. Okay, let's just jump right into this idea of highest level competence. Most of us kind of assume that to be a master at something, well, it means you have to know every single chaotic detail, right? But what we're going to see today is that true mastery is actually the exact opposite. It's the ability to take this massive, chaotic volume of information and distill it all down into clear, highly actionable mastery.
So why do we overcomplicate everything? It's something we really need to reflect on. We often subconsciously equate complexity with intelligence. We see this massive spreadsheet or we hear a dizzying hour-long explanation, and we immediately think, wow, this person really knows their stuff. But as we'll explore in this explainer, there is this massive fundamental tension between how an amateur operates and how a true master thinks.
Well, the ultimate cure for all that overcomplication is something called the minimal effective dose, or MED. The MED is the exact amount of understanding and action required to literally cut through the noise and actually get a result. Nothing more, nothing less. And honestly, this is the true metric of expertise. If you can find that MED, you've completely conquered information overload.
All right, let's get into part one, the amateur's trap. To really grasp mastery, we first got to look at its polar opposite, the amateur. You see, making things complicated is actually their path of least intellectual resistance. It's way easier to just throw everything at the wall than to figure out what actually matters. When an amateur lacks true comprehension, they tend to use a three-step defense mechanism to hide it. They deploy jargon, they operate out of a fear of the gap, and finally, they just cause massive information overload. Let's break this down.
So step one is deploying jargon. Look, just listing out every single enzyme in a pathway doesn't actually make you an expert. It's using jargon as armor. The rapid deployment of highly technical terms, obscure concepts, and just an overwhelming barrage of data creates this superficial air of expertise. But it's a mask. It completely hides the fact that the person speaking hasn't actually identified the primary leverage point. They're giving you a mountain of data, but zero genuine insight.
And that leads us right into step two, the fear of the gap. This happens when people are just terrified of the unknown, or they feel completely compelled to fill every single informational gap in a conversation. So, what do? They just present everything. They just dump all the data on you because they haven't done the stressful, grueling, critical work of separating the essential stuff from the pure noise.
Which brings us to part two, the cost of overload. So what are the actual real-world consequences of this amateur mindset for someone who's just trying to learn or solve a problem? The wellness world actually gives us a perfect example of this, the cookbook approach. Imagine going to an expert for help, right? And they hand you 1,000 rules, a list of 500 different supplements, and dozens of totally conflicting diets. It perfectly mimics that crushing feeling of absolute chaos.
And the ultimate result of the amateur's approach? Analysis paralysis. The learner, or the client, is just left completely frozen, totally unable to take a single step forward because they are buried under the sheer weight of all this expert advice. Meanwhile, the amateur gets to just walk away feeling like they've done their job simply because they sounded incredibly complicated.
Let's pivot here to part three, the genius's challenge.
Now we're going to flip the script entirely and introduce our second archetype, the genius. If the amateur makes things unnecessarily complicated, the genius's true challenge is to make them simple. True synthesis requires understanding a complex system at its absolute deepest, most integrated level. So on one side you have the ease of complication, the chaotic, defensive mess of the amateur, but on the other side you have the profound difficulty of simplicity. The genius has done all the grueling work behind the scenes, so the final product looks entirely effortless.
And there's this absolutely crucial quote we have to remember here. Simplicity is not the starting point of knowledge, it is the endpoint of ruthless critical analysis. I mean, read that again. Simplicity is earned. It comes through rigorous, grueling synthesis, not from intellectual laziness. You don't just magically start with a simple answer, you have to fight through the complexity to find it.
So how does a genius actually achieve that kind of simplicity? Well, they apply the Pareto principle. They zero in on that tiny fraction, the 20% of core variables that are actually driving 80% of the outcomes. They completely ignore the distractions and focus entirely on the heavy hitters.
To make this a bit more concrete, let's look at a specific health example from our source material. Imagine a patient walking in with a vast, confusing array of metabolic issues. An amateur, they'd prescribe 50 different treatments to chase every symptom. But an act of true genius synthesis is reducing all of that chaos down to one simple core focus, mitochondrial efficiency.
That's the leverage point right there. That is the 20% doing the 80% of the work.
But listen, getting to that single focus, it is not for the faint of heart. Simple, unconventional solutions require an immense amount of courage. Why? Because it means actively, consciously choosing to ignore the 99 minor details that literally all the mainstream approaches are obsessing over.
It takes absolute bravery and honestly, deep knowledge to look a client in the eye and say, look, out of these 50 potential interventions everyone else is talking about, only 3 really matter for you specifically. You're stepping up and shielding them from the noise.
All right, final section, part 4, actionable clarity.
All of this builds toward one ultimate goal, creating the absolute shortest, clearest path from where you are to your desired outcome. Let's set up a vivid analogy to compare these two paths one last time. Imagine trying to fix a horribly faulty engine. The amateur's approach, exhaustively changing every single part until the engine eventually, hopefully, starts working again. It's wildly expensive, it's exhausting, and it lacks any kind of precision. But the genius approach? The genius takes the time to deeply understand the system, bypassing all those mechanical detours to find the exact specific failure point. Because the genius knows exactly which single tiny capacitor is actually causing the whole system to fail. That is true mastery. You're not replacing the whole engine, you're just replacing the one tiny faulty piece. So here's the absolute crucial takeaway from this explainer. Distilling complex data into elegant, actionable principles, completely free of academic detours and confusing jargon, that is the true hallmark of a master. It is literally the absolute highest value service you can provide to anyone trying to learn from you. Which leaves us with this final, kind of provocative thought to chew on today. Think about your own habits, whether you're communicating an idea, managing a team, or just trying to solve a tough problem in your own life. Are you operating like the amateur, building 1,000 rules and just adding layers of complexity? Or are you doing the grueling, brilliant work of the genius, hunting for your single capacitor? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this helps you find your own path to true distilled mastery.